Hello, my dear listener. Do you know who lives next to you? Do you know who your neighbors really are? Have you ever thought that the nice and kind people you see every day when you leave your apartment are not who they seem? My next story is about that. The secret I will reveal will shock you. If you are ready, then let's begin. Eva Morris was born and raised in an old industrial area of Detroit, where the streets were gray and people's faces were tired. From early childhood, she was drawn to the mysteries of life and death. While other children played tag, Ava spent hours looking at old medical reference books found in the library. She understood her calling early. Anatomy fascinated her. In decay, in the fragility of the body shell, she saw something majestic, almost sacred. She struggled through medical school, but she never gave up. Her classmates called her Ice Miss Morris for her lack of emotion during practical classes in the morgue. Even the most seasoned students sometimes turned away at the sight of their first autopsies, but not Eva. Her movements were precise, confident, without a hint of trembling. When asked once in class how she could work so calmly with the dead, she replied coldly, "The living scare me much more." After graduation, she was hired at the city morgue at St. Luke's County Hospital. It was a place where time seemed to stand still. Cracked tiles on the floor, old fluorescent lights dimly illuminating rows of metal tables. Ava quickly earned the respect of her senior colleagues. Her reports were impeccable, her conclusions precise, and her hands surgically precise. The morgue chief, Dr. Harvey Lake, often said to others, "If I ever end up on that table, I want Morris to take me apart." Eva's life was frighteningly monotonous. Work, home, occasional grocery shopping. She had almost no friends. The morgue staff sometimes invited her to corporate meetings or barbecues, but Eva always declined, citing fatigue. Her apartment was in perfect order. Anatomy books, neatly folded lab coats, surgical instruments in a drawer, clean to a shine. Everything was sterile, almost dead, like the owner herself. Sometimes, late at night, sitting alone in an old leather chair with a glass of cheap wine, Eva felt a strange emptiness inside herself, as if there was an empty hole in her chest. She tried to fill it with work, discipline, cleanliness, but with each passing year the emptiness grew deeper, and yet nothing foreshadowed trouble, until one incident. It was an ordinary October evening. A cold wind whistled outside, driving dry leaves along the streets. The body of an unknown man was brought to the morgue. Without documents, found in an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. Nothing unusual. About 40 years old, severe exhaustion, traces of old wounds. Ava, as usual, put on gloves, prepared the tools, and got to work. But that night, for the first time, it seemed to her that the body was looking at her. Of course, this was stupidity, pure physiology. She convinced herself of this. Muscles sometimes twitch. Pupils can retain a reflection. Even skin can change color slightly. She knew this better than anyone, and yet every time she lowered the scalpel, she felt someone's cold, unblinking gaze on herself. She finished the work, wrote up a report, everything went as usual. But when she returned home, she could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined a man's face, gray, empty, and still alive. In the following weeks, small oddities began to occur. Her hands began to shake slightly while she worked, barely noticeable. Eva increasingly caught herself on strange sensations, as if someone was standing behind her in an empty morgue. Once she even turned around and saw no one, but cold sweat had already appeared on her forehead. Co-workers began to notice that she had changed. She became irritable, easily angered, avoided living people even more than before. Dr. Lake once called her to him and, stammering, advised her to take a vacation. Eva refused. Work was the only support in her world. But the crack had already run deep. She just didn't know yet that her own mind had begun a conspiracy against her. And soon this thin crack would grow into a bottomless abyss. After that evening, everything went completely downhill. A month after the incident in the morgue, Eva Morris was fired, formally for health reasons, in reality because no one else wanted to work next to her. Her colleagues whispered behind her back, strange, cold, with eyes full of some kind of painful tension. Her reports began to contain absurd errors. Once, right during an autopsy, she suddenly screamed and dropped the scalpel, as if she saw something on the body being dissected. Dr. Harvey Lake took pity. He signed the papers quickly to avoid official proceedings. Better for her to rest somewhere far away, he muttered into the phone to the head of the psychiatric department. But Eva refused any help. She locked herself in her apartment as if in a coffin. Then the real darkness began. The light in the apartment was rarely on. The blinds were tightly closed. The windows were sealed with a black garbage bag and tape so that even the weak glimmer of day did not penetrate inside. Eva rarely left the house, only once a week to the supermarket 3 blocks away, where the salespeople had become accustomed to her appearance. A thin, empty-eyed woman in a gray coat, keeping her distance from everyone. People irritated her. Their laughter, their bustle, their banal conversations about the weather and discounts. But most of all, it was the sounds that irritated her, especially the knocking. The neighbors upstairs were starting renovations, and every blow of the hammer echoed in her skull like a red-hot nail. Eva took handfuls of pills, painkillers, sedatives, sometimes even old university stocks of sleeping pills. They were almost no longer effective. Sometimes she sat in the corner of the kitchen, clutching her head in her hands, rocking back and forth like a wounded animal. The loud blow of the hammer over her head was like a gunshot. She tried to fight. At first politely, she pounded on the ceiling with a mop, then louder with her fists, then with heart-rending screams. "Shut up!" she screamed, pressing her forehead against the cold wall. "Shut up, you bastard!" One day she ran out into the entrance barefoot, in her nightgown, and began to furiously pound her fists on the door of a neighboring apartment where renovations were underway. People looked at her through peepholes and did not open the door. And then the voices came. At first they were echoes, rustling in the walls, quiet whispers, like the creaking of old parquet. But the longer Eva sat locked up, the clearer they became. Especially one, the loudest, the most persistent. The voice whispered to her, "They are bothering you. They are laughing at you. They are living and you are rotting. Kill. Kill them all." Sometimes the voice sounded right behind her, sometimes inside her head. At first she resisted. She covered her ears with her palms, pressed herself against the walls, sobbed into the pillow. But the voice did not disappear. It became brighter and clearer, acquired intonations. At first rough, imperious, then caring, almost maternal. "I will help you," he whispered. "You will become strong again." Sometimes it began to seem to her that the walls of the apartment were moving, as if invisible creatures were swarming under a thin layer of wallpaper. The light in the hallway flickered by itself, and in the bathroom, in a crack under the ceiling, she saw blackening spots of mold, reminiscent of human faces. Her personality was cracking at the seams. Every night she sat on the floor in the middle of the kitchen, huddled into a ball, and listened to someone scratching on the other side of the wall. When the rustling died down, when the neighbors finally fell asleep, the voice whispered again, "They won't wake up again if you want. Just reach out your hand. After all, you already know how to handle bodies." On the kitchen table, Next to the empty pill bottles lay her old pathologist's scalpel, a relic of a past life, and every night it seemed less and less alien to her. While the neighbors still did not suspect that their house, their ordinary 5-story building on the outskirts of Detroit, had turned into a cage. And inside, behind the door of apartment number 308, real insane death was slowly and inexorably maturing. Eva Morris had almost ceased to be human. Her existence was reduced to the simplest reflexes: sleeping, taking pills, listening to the whispers in her head. Sometimes, in rare moments of weakness, she looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror of the bathroom. A thin, sunken face, dark circles under her eyes, lips drawn into a thin line. Who was this woman she did not know? And perhaps she no longer wanted to know. One day, a voice told her, "It's time to get ready." And she understood this was not a request. This was an order. The weather was dark, damp, unpleasant when Eva left her apartment for the first time in many months, not to get groceries. Her coat hung on her like a hanger. Her bag dangled from her shoulder. She walked slowly along the cracked sidewalks to a large hardware store on the outskirts. A huge hanger with a neon Build Pro logo pulsed in the fog. The light inside was too bright, pressing on her eyes. Eva felt like every person in the store was looking at her, whispering behind her back. Although, of course, it wasn't so. Or was it? She methodically walked along the rows. "A metal saw," she said quietly, approaching the tool department. Heavy, sharp. In her hands, the saw seemed frighteningly light. "Gloves." A whisper in her head prompted. "Thick ones, so as not to leave marks. Plastic film, how could we do without it? Wrap it up. Hide it. Remove marks." Eva carefully placed the purchases in the cart, as if she were preparing for a routine repair. A hammer, a utility knife, large black garbage bags, several packages of bleach. Her face was frozen in an empty mask. Neither the salespeople nor the other customers paid much attention to the strange woman in the gray coat. In this area, people had long since learned not to ask unnecessary questions. "Are you repairing something?" the cashier asked casually, scanning the purchases. "Yes," Eva answered in an even voice, and her lips twitched in a ghostly semblance of a smile. Returning home, she immediately began preparing. In the bathroom, she removed the shelf from the sink and freed up space. In the old pantry in the kitchen, she cleared out some space. She installed a couple of spotlights, bought in advance to work in bright light. She placed an old plastic tub that she used to use for washing right in the center of the room. Every action she took was carefully thought out. No fuss, cool, practical. The voice inside continued to speak, enveloping her consciousness in a viscous calm. "You are preparing correctly. The time will come soon." Sometimes at night, when Eva sat on the floor, hugging her knees with her hands, it seemed to her that the house was breathing, that under the floors, in the rotten beams of the walls, something alive was moving, and all this was waiting for only one thing: a command. The noise of the renovation in the house grew louder. Workers hired by one of the families on the 5th floor scurried along the corridors from morning to evening. The sound of hammers, the roar of drills, the grinding of reinforcement penetrated even through the thick walls of her apartment. Each blow was like a chisel in her temples. She listened. She remembered the voices. One of the workers, a red-haired man of about 30, especially irritated her. He always spoke loudly in a rough voice, laughed so that the glass rattled, and the whisper in her head became especially impatient when his laughter was heard. "He will be the first," the voice hissed. Eva silently went to the kitchen, took a saw out of the cupboard, and carefully wiped invisible dust from it. Her body barely resisted fear. Her mind was like an icy emptiness, where the words echoed lonely. You know how to handle bodies. You always knew. And that night, when the corridors were silent, when the city was shrouded in fog, and the rare streetlights barely made it through the dirty windows, Eva got up from the floor, put on gloves, and carefully opened the door of the apartment. Her steps were silent. In her hand she was clutching a hammer, the same one she had bought for repairs. The hammering above her head continued for days. With each blow, it was as if some thin spring was cracking in Eva's head. The pills were no longer helping. The voice had become almost constant, a muffled background subordinating her every thought. And then, on one particularly difficult day, when the rain was pouring down in sheets, and someone was hammering on her head again so hard that the dishes in the cupboard were rattling, Eva broke down. Not remembering herself, she threw open the front door and ran out into the hallway barefoot, in a dirty gray t-shirt and sweatpants. Her hair was tangled, her face was twisted with rage. She ran up the stairs, clinging to the railing with trembling hands. On the 5th floor, near apartment 514, she saw them. 3 workers. One was planing something near the door, another was carrying sacks, and the third, a red-haired man, was standing with his legs apart and laughing loudly, fanning himself with a sheet of drywall. Eva ran up to them and screamed hysterically, breaking into a shriek. "Stop it, immediately! You're killing me! You! All of you!" The workers froze. The redhead slowly lowered the cardboard, looking at her with obvious disgust. "Lady, cool down, will you?" he muttered. "We have to work, you understand." Eva rushed to him and pushed him in the chest with her fist, a weak but furious blow. "You don't understand," she screamed in the man's face. "You're all dead. Can you hear that? Dead." The noise attracted the attention of the apartment's owners, a young couple, Jared and Kimberly Clark. They ran out into the hallway, the woman in a robe, the man in jeans and a t-shirt. Eva, please," Kimberly began softly, coming closer, raising her hands in a conciliatory gesture. "Let's calm down. We'll take a break for today, okay? You need to rest." Eva was shaking with rage. She was boring into Kimberly with eyes full of fierce hatred. "You're all going to suffer," she whispered through her teeth. "You brought this on yourselves. No one will save you." Jared, clenching his fists, stepped forward sharply and slammed the door right in her face. The click of the lock sounded like a gunshot to Eva. The hallway went silent. Only her hoarse, ragged breathing and the pounding of blood in her ears filled the space. She stood there for a few more minutes, staring at the closed door, and then, slowly turning, she went downstairs, her bare feet shuffling on the dirty concrete floor. She hadn't slept that night. She sat in the kitchen in complete darkness, listening to invisible fingers scratching at the walls. The whispers became almost a song. The voice was clearer than ever. "They are humiliating you. They want to drive you out. They are laughing. They deserve it." Next to her, on the table, lay a scalpel, a hammer, and a sharp hacksaw for metal. Black bags from the hardware store lay neatly stacked under the table. Eva bent over the tools, ran her finger along the cold steel. She no longer felt fear, only a strange relief, as if a heavy burden that had been pressing on her shoulders for so many years had finally fallen off. "I'll fix this," she thought, with a crooked, empty smile. When the clock in the hallway struck 3 in the morning, she put on a dark jacket, pulled up her hood, and quietly went out into the entrance. The hallway was empty. Not a sound, not a light. She knew that the workers had stayed overnight in the Clarks' apartment. After the quarrel, they were afraid of her, but there was too much work, the deadline was pressing, and the landlady insisted only quietly. The redhead was her target. She slid along the wall to apartment 514. The lock was old, jammed, did not close well. She knew in advance the door could be carefully pried open with a spatula, which she took with her. 5 minutes, and the lock clicked. She entered. The apartment smelled of cement dust, sweat, and dampness. On the floor, right in the hallway, on an old mattress, the redhead was sleeping, with his arms outstretched, his jacket unbuttoned. Eva stood over him for a few seconds, listening to his snoring, watching the thin blue vein pulsate on his neck. Then she raised the hammer and struck. 1, 2, 3. The crunch of the skull was short, vile, and after the third blow the redhead no longer moved. Blood covered the floor, flowed into the cracks between the tiles. The whisper in her head laughed like an old woman. Eva stood, breathing heavily, looking at her work. "Now you are one of us," the voice hissed. And at that moment it seemed to her that the whole house froze, listening to the beginning of a new, real life for Eva Morris. The red-haired man's body lay in the bathroom for 2 days. Eva kept putting it off. She sat on the floor next to him, rocking back and forth, stroking the cold skin of the dead man, whispering something unintelligible. Sometimes she began to talk to him out loud like an old friend, asking if he was cold, if it was comfortable to lie down. The red-haired man, of course, was silent, but in Eva's head his whispers sounded louder and louder, promising the warmth and love that she had been deprived of all her life. On the third night she got to work. Turning on the spotlights, Eva put on gloves, a mask, and took out a metal saw. She worked methodically, like in the morgue, like she had once done in that past life. The crunch of bones was disgusting, the meat tore tightly. The blood had almost coagulated, but it still poured into the bathtub in thick streams, flowing into the pipe. She was in no hurry. She enjoyed the process. She carefully wrapped each cut piece in construction film, securing it with tape. There were already 6 packages in the corner of the bathroom when Eva wiped the sweat from her forehead and looked around. It smelled of blood, metal, and bleach. A sickening smell began to penetrate the hallway, hiding in the cracks of the old wallpaper. But it did not bother her. Now it was time for repairs. The next day, Eva left the apartment again, went to Build Pro again. The shopping lists were simple: bags of cement, drywall, putty, metal mesh, new tools for laying bricks. She wrote it all off on the invoice as cosmetic repairs to the bathroom. Returning home, she could hardly contain her trembling anticipation. The workers in the house looked at her warily, but said nothing. There were fewer of them. After the red-haired man disappeared, several people quit. Only 2 remained, young, inexperienced, who were not embarrassed by the strange atmosphere. They did not know that their time was almost up too. Eva began the renovation with the bathroom. The bathtub, old cast iron, heavy, was ideal for her plan. She cleared one wall down to the brick, gouged out a recess in it. Then, in a trough of acid that stood in the kitchen, she dipped the red-haired man's severed hands into it. She waited for 3 days. The acid had eaten away the flesh, leaving only yellowish bones. Dark nails were still attached to the fingers like dirty claws. Eva carefully inserted her hands into the holes in the bathroom wall so that the finger bones stuck out, like creepy hooks. For towels, for future guests. She carefully walled up the base of the hands with cement mixture, puttied painted the wall a dull gray. From a distance, everything looked harmless. Only on closer inspection could one notice crooked, gnawed fingers sticking out of the tiles. Her heart beat steadily. Everything was going according to plan. The next step was the walls of the corridor. She cleared them down to the brick, dismantled the old plaster, punched out deep niches. She carefully placed the bundles with the remains of the workers, already different ones, who disappeared after the red-haired one, there, one after another. Heads wrapped in a bag, twisted limbs. Sometimes Eva couldn't resist dismembering the bodies even more, exposing the bones and joints. She stroked them with a cold hand, like an artist admiring his sculpture. Before walling up another bundle, she would sometimes whisper quietly, "Now you will always be with me." Then she would seal the masonry, cover the walls with fresh plasterboard, and smooth out the seams. A dull echo began to come from the apartment. The house, as if saturated with death, began to change. It was becoming an extension of Eva. When the renovation was almost finished, Eva sat in the dark kitchen, looked at the new walls, inhaled the heavy smell of damp cement and old blood. The whisper in her head became calm, peaceful. "You have created the perfect home," it whispered. "Your children will always be near." On the kitchen wall, she drew a thin-line drawing of the future work. New niches, new bodies. There was still a lot of work to do. And while outside the apartment walls, people were rushing to work, laughing, having children. Inside Eva Morris's apartment, something ancient and vile was growing, and it was just beginning to breathe. The smell appeared after a few weeks. At first it was a slight rotting, barely noticeable, like a wet rag stuck behind the tiles. But with each passing day, the stench became thicker, heavier. It crawled out from under the new walls, seeped into the ventilation, clung to the clothes of the residents. The neighbors began to complain. Old Mrs. Donovan from the 4th floor, having barely opened the door, gasped loudly, holding her nose with her hand. The young couple from apartment 306 talked on the landing about a dead animal somewhere in the walls. Even the children, running along the corridors, wrinkled their noses and whispered about the smelly ghost. But Eva did not pay attention. For her, this smell was familiar. The house was alive now, and it smelled of death, as it should have. One morning, when Eva was sitting in the kitchen, idly drawing on the dirty tablecloth with the tip of a knife, the doorbell rang. She froze. Then, slowly, like a mechanical doll, she stood up and went to the peephole. 2 men stood behind the door, in dark clothes with badges on their chests. The police. "Miss Morris," a muffled voice was heard. "We would like to talk to you." Eva did not open the door right away. Something was stirring inside her, torn between panic and icy calm. The voice in her head whispered almost tenderly, "They have come to take you away." Gritting her teeth, she finally opened the door with the chain. "What happened?" she asked quietly, trying to give her face an indifferent expression. "There have been complaints about a strange smell," said one of the policemen, tall and with tired eyes. "We're going door to door to find out the source. Did you notice anything?" Eva shook her head. I don't smell anything. I have trouble smelling." The second policewoman, a woman with short hair, was looking at her and the hallway behind her. Her gaze was sharp and cold. "Can I come in and have a look around?" Standard procedure. Eva felt her inside shrink into a lump of ice, but her face remained calm. She knew that if she showed even the slightest sign of fear now, she would be exposed. "Sorry," she said evenly. "I'm sick, flu. Live with my cough for a couple of minutes, and you'll want to run away yourself." She smiled weakly. The policemen exchanged glances. The woman, the one with the short hair, wanted to say something, but her partner raised his hand. "I understand, Ms. Morris. Thank you for your cooperation. If you notice anything, call." They left. The door slammed shut, The locks clicked one after another. Eva stood in the hallway, leaning her forehead against the cold door, breathing heavily. Her temples pounded like hammers. Her palms were damp with sweat. A voice in her head hissed quietly, "They'll be back. They've already put a mark on you." She knew her chances were slim. She knew the walls of the house wouldn't be able to hold back the smell any longer, and she knew they'd be more persistent next time. But there was no fear inside her, just a clear plan. That same evening, on the dirty kitchen wall, next to the childish scribbles of plans, she drew a new diagram. Escape routes, escape plans, and, in the very corner of the sheet, a short, bold inscription. "If they start looking, I'll start a new collection." Beyond the walls of her apartment, in the stuffy corridors, among the moldy stairwells, a quiet panic was beginning. People whispered about the missing workers, about the stinking air, about the strange, lonely woman in the gray coat. And when the police station began to draw up a list of suspects, the first name on it was short and dry: Morris Eva, apartment 308. They returned 3 days later. No longer polite, no longer hesitant. 2 in uniform, 1 in civilian clothes. The officer, with a hard face, held a warrant in his hands. The paper was for the form. Those who came already knew where they were going. Eva met them in the same dirty gray t-shirt. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes were shining, her lips were dry and cracked. A strange expression froze on her face, a mixture of politeness and indifference, behind which an abyss pulsated. "Miss Morris," the officer said, "we have a search warrant." Eva silently retreated into the apartment, throwing the door wide open. "Come in," she said quietly. "Welcome." There were 3 of them. 2 immediately moved into the bathroom and kitchen. The plainclothes officer remained in the hallway, looking at the peeling walls with disgust. The smell in the apartment was terrible. Even the fresh coat of paint that Eva had tried to muffle the rot didn't help. A heavy smell of flesh hung in the air, enveloping everyone who dared to step inside. They began to quickly inspect the rooms. Eva stood in the hallway, her head tilted to the side, watching them with empty eyes. When one of the officers pushed the door to the bathroom, he froze on the threshold. The light from the lamp picked out the bones of hands sticking out of the wall from the semi-darkness. "What the hell?" he whispered. The second one approached, and then recoiled. The plainclothes officer reacted quickly, reaching for the radio. This was what Eva had been waiting for. With a hoarse cry, she rushed at him with the hammer hidden behind her back. The blade of the blow hit the man in the temple. The skull crunched. Blood gushed onto the floor, instantly forming a puddle. The policeman fell, twitching. The other 2, turning in panic at the sound, grabbed their weapons. "Back! Back!" one screamed. Eva, like a ghost, disappeared into the hallway. The house knew her steps. The house was her ally. A dull thud sounded in the darkness of the corridors and old rooms. A door slammed somewhere. Someone dropped a flashlight, and a weak beam of light darted across the floor, snatching disgusting details from the darkness. Charred bones walled up in the walls, dark spots showing through fresh paint, pieces of fabric, torn, bloody, glued into the corners. The apartment became a living nightmare. One of the officers began to retreat toward the exit, but slipped on the blood and fell heavily to the floor. A figure darted out of the darkness. Eva, with a gleam in her eyes, flew at him, plunging a sharp construction knife into his throat. A jerk, a gurgling scream. The body jerked, thrashed, and fell silent. The remaining policeman, jumping back in horror, fired a couple of shots into the darkness. The bullets thudded into the walls. The house seemed to shudder from the echo. He shouted into the radio. An officer is wounded. We need backup. Apartment 308, I repeat, urgently. But there was no answer. The whole house seemed to hold its breath. Eva stood in the shadows, next to the hanging bags made of thick black plastic, inside which her children were hiding. Blood flowed down her forearms, dripped onto the floor, leaving scarlet marks. She breathed quickly, intermittently, but a cold, mad fire burned in her eyes. She knew this was the end, but not hers, the end of them. Dark smoke was already pouring out of the windows of the apartment. Somewhere in the depths of the house, Eva had set fire to old rags soaked in acetone. The flames crawled along the walls, licked the old beams. The house, like her, wanted to take them all with it. At the last moment, before the smoke and fire-engulfed entryway filled with screams and sirens, Eva whispered into the dusty darkness, "This is just the beginning." When the firefighters burst in half an hour later, apartment number 308 was shrouded in thick smoke. The remains of the police lay among the charred bags, the walls cracked, revealing the terrible contents. And Eva Morris was nowhere to be found, gone, dissolved into the black heart of the house, as if she herself had become a part of it. But among the firefighters and police officers examining the ruins, a rumor began to spread that someone had seen a female figure in the smoke, walking away into the darkness without turning around. And now the Detroit police reports had a new name on the wanted list. Morris Eva, dangerous, presumably armed, suspected of multiple murders. The fire engulfed the entire entryway. The old beams, soaked with moisture and time, burned sluggishly, with thick, greasy smoke, enveloping everything around in a suffocating haze. Horrible finds were found among the rubble and smoldering walls. Skulls, twisted bones, charred scraps of flesh. The newspapers wrote about a nightmare discovery and a horrific ritual crime. The police combed the city, but Eva Morris was nowhere to be found. Some said that she died in the fire. Others whispered that they saw her standing among the ashes, with a scorched face and empty eyes, looking at the rescuers through walls of smoke. And then she disappeared, like a shadow. But the truth was more terrible. 3 months later, her trail surfaced in another state, Louisiana, a small, godforsaken town with a dozen streets, peeling houses, foggy swamps beyond the outskirts, and an old multi-story building on the edge of town, where apartments were rented out for next to nothing. The house was quiet, musty, with creaky stairs and peeling walls. An ideal place for a new life. Eva arrived at night in the pouring rain. Now she looked different. Short-cropped hair, re-dyed dirty blonde, large dark glasses, shapeless clothes hiding her figure. Fake documents bought from drug dealers in another city said that her name was Susan Rose. The neighbors didn't remember her. They didn't like to pry into other people's business. And Eva, Susan, silently accepted the keys to the apartment on the 3rd floor, nodding gratefully to the skinny manager. The apartment was squalid. Dirty linoleum, rusty faucets, peeling walls. But Eva felt she was home. The first week she tidied up the apartment. She tore off old wallpaper, carefully washed the walls, silently marked out the layout of the future niches on the floor with chalk. The emptiness that had quieted down for a while after the fire began to stir in her chest again. The voice in her head returned, at first in a whisper, then louder. "You're not alone." At night, lying on a creaky iron bed, she heard footsteps behind the wall. Someone was carefully creeping along the corridors, scratching the plaster, quietly laughing right behind her. The house accepted her. The house waited. On the 8th day, what she had been waiting for happened. Just as dawn was breaking, a knock was heard in the neighboring apartment above hers. Dull, heavy. Boom, boom, boom. A hammer. Someone had started repairs. The world thickened around Eva, became covered in gray haze. Images immediately flashed in her head. Walls pulsating from nails driven into them. Cracks spreading across the concrete, like veins on a swollen body. The flesh of the house was again demanding victims. Ava slowly rose from the bed. Her lips trembled. She smiled, her fingers clenched into fists. The whisper in her head merged with the blows of the hammer in a hypnotic rhythm. Boom, boom, boom. She went to the window. The city was waking up behind the dirty glass. Dull gray, completely saturated with dampness and mold. And this city would also become part of her work. Quietly, with love, Eva whispered into the empty room, "Go to the others." And the house, new, forgotten, hungry, joyfully echoed in the depths of its rotten walls. Eva closed the door with 3 locks, put an old keychain around her neck, and went into the shadow of the corridor. A new cycle was beginning, and now nothing can stop her anymore. This is the end for now, but do not forget that it depends only on you whether this story will get a second life. The one that gets the most likes and views will find its continuation with an equally creepy and terrible development of events. Everything depends only on you. Thank you for being with us.